Franz Schubert.
Franz Peter Schubert was an Austrian composer. In a short lifespan of less than 32 years, Schubert was a prolific composer, writing some 600 lieder, 10 complete or nearly complete symphonies, liturgical music, operas, incidental music and a large body of chamber and solo piano music. Appreciation of his music while he was alive was limited to a relatively small circle of admirers in Vienna, but interest in his work increased significantly in the decades immediately after his death. Felix Mendelssohn, Robert Schumann, Franz Liszt, Johannes Brahms and other 19th-century composers discovered and championed his works. Today, Schubert is ranked among the greatest composers of the early Romantic era and, as such, is one of the most frequently performed composers of the early 19th century.
Biography. Early life and education.
Schubert was born in Himmelportgrund, now a part of Alsergrund, Vienna, on January 31, 1797. His father, Franz Theodor Schubert, the son of a Moravian peasant, was a parish schoolmaster. His mother, Elisabeth Weiertz, was the daughter of a Silesian master locksmith and had been a housemaid for a Viennese family before her marriage. Of Franz Theodor's 14 children, one of them illegitimate, born in 1783, 9 died in infancy and only 5 survived. Their father was a well-known teacher, and his school in Lichtental, in Vienna's 9th district, was well attended. He was not a well-known or even formally trained musician, but was able to pass on certain musical basics to his gifted son. At the age of 6, Franz began to receive regular instruction from his father and a year later was enrolled at his father's school. His formal musical education also started around the same time. His father taught him basic violin technique, and his brother Ignaz gave him piano lessons. At the age of 7, he was given his first lessons outside the family by Michael Holzer, organist and choir master of the local parish church in Lichtental, lessons which may have largely consisted of conversations and expressions of admiration. The boy seemed to gain more from his acquaintance with the friendly joiner's apprentice who used to take him to a neighboring pianoforte warehouse where he could practice on better instruments. He also played viola in the family string quartet, with brothers Ferdinand and Ignaz on first and second violin and his father on the cello. He wrote his earliest string quartets for this ensemble. Young Schubert first came to the attention of Antonio Salieri, then Vienna's leading musical authority, in 1804, when his vocal talent was recognized. In October 1808, he became a pupil at the State Convict, Imperial Seminary, through a choir scholarship. At the State Convict, he was introduced to the overtures and symphonies of Mozart and the symphonies of Joseph and Michael Haydn. His exposure to these and lesser works, combined with occasional visits to the opera, laid the foundation for a broader musical education. One important musical influence came from the songs of Johann Rudolph Zumsteeg, who was an important lieder composer of the time, which, his friend Joseph von Spaun reported, the precocious young student wanted to modernize. Schubert's friendship with Spaun began at the State Convict and lasted throughout his short life. In those early days, the financially well-off Spaun furnished the impoverished Schubert with much of his manuscript paper. In the meantime, his genius began to show in his compositions. Schubert was occasionally permitted to lead the State Convict's orchestra, and Salieri decided to start training him privately in music theory and even in composition. It was the first orchestra he wrote for, and he devoted much of the rest of his time at the State Convict to composing chamber music, several songs, piano pieces and, more ambitiously, liturgical choral works in the form of a Kyrie, D31, and a Salve-Regina, D27, in addition to a wind octet, D72 72 said to commemorate the 1812 death of his mother, a cantata for guitar and male voices, D110, for his father's birthday in 1813, and his first symphony, D82.
Teacher at his father's school.
At the end of 1813, he left the State Convict and returned home for teacher training at the Normalhauptschule. In 1814, he entered his father's school as a teacher of the youngest pupils. For over 2 years young Schubert endured such drudgery, dragging himself through it with resounding indifference. There were, however, compensatory interests even then. He continued to take private lessons in composition from Salieri, who gave Schubert more actual technical training than any of his other teachers before they parted ways in 1817. In 1814, Schubert met a young soprano named Therese Grob, daughter of a local silk manufacturer, and wrote several of his liturgical works, including a Salve Regina and a Tantum Ergo, for her. She also was a soloist in the premiere of his first Mass, D 105, in September 1814. Schubert wanted to marry her, but was hindered by the harsh marriage consent law of 1815 requiring an aspiring bridegroom to show he had the means to support a family. In November 1816, after failing to gain a musical post in Leipzig, Schubert sent Grob's brother Heinrich a collection of songs retained by the family into the 20th century. One of Schubert's most prolific years was 1815. He composed over 20,000 bars of music, more than half of which was for orchestra, including 9 church works, despite being agnostic, a symphony, and about 140 lieder. In that year, he was also introduced to Anselm Hartenbrenner and Franz von Schober, who would become his lifelong friends. Another friend, Johann Mayhofer, was introduced to him by Spaun in 1814. Maynard Solomon suggested that Schubert was erotically attracted to men, a thesis that has, at times, been heatedly debated. Musicologist and Schubert expert Rita Splin claimed that he was chasing women.
Supported by friends.
Significant changes happened in 1816. Schober, a student of good family and some means, invited Schubert to room with him at his mother's house. The proposal was particularly opportune, for Schubert had just made the unsuccessful application for the post of Kapellmeister at Leipzig, and he had also decided not to resume teaching duties at his father's school. By the end of the year, he became a guest in Schober's lodgings. For a time, he attempted to increase the household resources by giving music lessons, but they were soon abandoned, and he devoted himself to composition. "I compose every morning, and when one piece is done, I begin another." During this year, he focused on orchestral and choral works, although he also continued to write lieder, songs. Much of this work was unpublished, but manuscripts and copies circulated among friends and admirers. In early 1817, Schober introduced Schubert to Johann Michael Vogel, a prominent baritone 20 years Schubert's senior. Vogel, for whom Schubert went on to write a great many songs, became one of Schubert's main proponents in Viennese musical circles. He also met Joseph Hartenbrenner, brother to Anselm, who also played a role in promoting Schubert's music. These, and an increasing circle of friends and musicians, became responsible for promoting, collecting, and, after his death, preserving his work. In late 1817, Schubert's father gained a new position at a school in Rossau, not far from Lichtental. Schubert rejoined his father and reluctantly took up teaching duties there. In early 1818, he was rejected for membership in the prestigious Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, something that might have furthered his musical career. However, he began to gain more notice in the press, and the first public performance of a secular work, an overture performed in February 1818, received praise from the press in Vienna and abroad. Schubert spent the summer of 1818 as music teacher to the family of Count Johann Karl Esterhazy at their chateau in Zlaz, then in Austria, now in Slovakia. His duties were relatively light, teaching piano and singing to the 2 daughters, Marie and Caroline, and the pay was relatively good. As a result, he happily continued to compose during this time. It may have been at this time that he wrote one of his now world-famous compositions, the March Militaire No. 1 in D major. Marie and Caroline both being his piano students, and the original score of March Militaire being a piano duet, lend credence to this view. On his return from Zlaz, he took up residence with his friend Mayhofer. The respite at Zlaz led to a succession of compositions for piano duet. During the early 1820s, Schubert was part of a close-knit circle of artists and students who had social gatherings together that became known as Schubertiaden. The tight circle of friends with which Schubert surrounded himself was dealt a blow in early 1820. Schubert and 4 of his friends were arrested by the Austrian police, who, in the aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, were on their guard against revolutionary activities and suspicious of any gathering of youth or students. One of Schubert's friends, Johann Sen, was put on trial, imprisoned for over a year, and then permanently forbidden to enter Vienna. The other 4, including Schubert, were severely reprimanded, in part for inveighing against with insulting and opprobrious language. While Schubert never saw Sen again, he did set some of his poems, Slidwelt, and Schwanengesang, to music. The incident may have played a role in a falling out with Meyerhofer, with whom he was living at the time. He was nicknamed Schwamel by his friends, which Gibbs describes as translating to tubby, or little mushroom. Schubert, at 1.52 m height, was not quite 5 feet tall. Schwamel is Austrian, and other, dialect for mushroom. The umlaut makes it a diminutive.
Musical maturity.
The compositions of 1819 and 1820 show a marked advance in development and maturity of style. The unfinished oratorio Lazarus, d. 689, was begun in February. Later followed, amid a number of smaller works, by the 23rd Psalm, d. 706, the Gesang der Geister, d. 705/714, the Quartettsatz in C minor, d. 703, and the Wanderer Fantasy for piano, d. 760. Of most notable interest is the staging in 1820 of 2 of Schubert's operas, Die Zwillingsbrüder, d. 647, appeared at the Theater am Kantnetter on June 14, and Die Zauberhof, d. 644, appeared at the Theater an der Wien on August 21. Hitherto, his larger compositions, apart from his masses, had been restricted to the amateur orchestra at the Gundelhof, a society which grew out of the quartet parties at his home. Now he began to assume a more prominent position, addressing a wider public. Publishers, however, remained distant, with Anton Diabelli hesitantly agreeing to print some of his works on commission. The first 7 opus numbers, all songs, appeared on these terms. Then the commission ceased, and he began to receive the meager pittances which were all that the great publishing houses ever paid him. The situation improved somewhat in March 1821 when Vogel sang Der Erlkönig at a concert that was extremely well received. That month, Schubert composed a variation on a waltz by Diabelli, d. 718, being one of the 50 composers who contributed to the Vaterländische Künstlerverein. The production of the 2 operas turned Schubert's attention more firmly than ever in the direction of the stage, where, for a variety of reasons, he was almost completely unsuccessful. All in all, he produced 17 stage works, each of them failures which were quickly forgotten. In 1822, Alfonso Undistrella was refused, partly owing to its libretto. Virabras, d. 796, was rejected in the fall of 1823, but this was largely due to the popularity of Rossini in the Italian operatic style, and the failure of Carl Maria von Weber's Euryanthe. Die Vershennen, The Conspirators, d. 787, was prohibited by the censor, apparently on the grounds of its title, and Rosamund, d. 797, was withdrawn after 2 nights, owing to the poor quality of the play for which Schubert had written incidental music. Of these works, the 2 former are written on a scale which would make their performances exceedingly difficult. Virabras, for instance, contains over 1,000 pages of manuscript score, but Die Vershennen is a bright attractive comedy, and Rosamund contains some of the most charming music that Schubert ever composed. In 1822, he made the acquaintance of both Weber and Beethoven, but little came of it in either case. Beethoven is said to have acknowledged the younger man's gifts on a few occasions, but some of this is likely legend, and in any case he could not have known the real scope of Schubert's music, especially not the instrumental works, as so little of it was printed or performed in the composer's lifetime. On his deathbed, Beethoven is said to have looked into some of the younger man's works and exclaimed, Truly, the spark of divine genius resides in this Schubert. But what would have come of it if he had recovered we can never know.
Last years in Masterworks.
Despite his preoccupation with the stage, and later with his official duties, Schubert found time during these years for a significant amount of composition. He completed the Mass in A-flat, D678, and, in 1822, embarked suddenly on a work which more decisively than almost any other in those years showed his maturing personal vision, the Unfinished Symphony in B minor. The reason he left it unfinished after 2 movements and sketches some way into a third remains an enigma, and it is also remarkable that he did not mention it to any of his friends even though, as Brian Nabould notes, he must have felt thrilled by what he was achieving. The event has been debated endlessly without resolution. In 1823 Schubert, in addition to Vier Obras, also wrote his first song cycle, Die Schönmalerin, D795, setting poems by Wilhelm Müller. This series, together with the later cycle Winter Eyes, D911, also setting texts of Müller in 1827, is widely considered one of the pinnacles of Lieder. He also composed the song Du bist die Ruhe, Your Stillness Piece D776 during this year. Also in that year, symptoms of syphilis first appeared. In 1824, he wrote the variations for flute and piano on Trockenblumen, from the cycle Die Schönmalerin, and several string quartets. He also wrote the Arpeggian Sonata, D821, at a time when there was a minor craze over that instrument. In the spring of that year he wrote the Octet in F, D803, a sketch for a grand symphony. And in the summer went back to Zaliz. There he became attracted to Hungarian musical idiom, and wrote the Divertissement à la Hongroise, D818, for piano duet and a string quartet in A minor, D804. It has been said that he held a hopeless passion for his pupil, the Countess Caroline Esterhazy, but the only work he dedicated to her was his Fantasie in F minor, D940, for piano duet. His friend Eduard von Bonfell penned the following verse, which appears to reference Schubert's unrequited sentiments. The setbacks of previous years were compensated by the prosperity and happiness of 1825. Publication had been moving more rapidly. The stress of poverty was for a time lightened. And in the summer he had a pleasant holiday in Upper Austria, where he was welcomed with enthusiasm. It was during this tour that he produced his songs from Sir Walter Scott. This cycle contains Ellen's Dritter Gesang, D839, a setting of Adam Storck's German translation of Scott's hymn from The Lady of the Lake, which is widely, though mistakenly, referred to as Schubert's Ave Maria. It opens with the greeting Ave Maria, which recurs in the refrain. The entire Scott-Storck text in Schubert's song is frequently substituted with the complete Latin text of the traditional Ave Maria prayer. In 1825, Schubert also wrote the Piano Sonata in A minor, Op. 42, D845, and began the Great C Major Symphony, Symphony No. 9, D944, which was completed the following year. From 1826 to 1828, Schubert resided continuously in Vienna, except for a brief visit to Graz in 1827. The history of his life during these 3 years was comparatively uninteresting, and is little more than a record of his compositions. In 1826, he dedicated a symphony, D944, that later came to be known as the Great to the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde and received an honorarium in return. In the spring of 1828, he gave, for the only time in his career, a public concert of his own works, which was very well received. The compositions themselves are a sufficient biography. The String Quartet in D minor, D810, with the variations on Death and the Maiden, was written during the winter of 1825 to 1826, and first played on January 25, 1826. Later in the year came the String Quartet in G major, D887, Op. 161, the Rondo Brilliant for piano and violin, D895, Op. 70, and the Piano Sonata in G, D894, Op. 78, first published under the title Fantasia in G. To these should be added the 3 Shakespearean songs, of which Hark! Hark! The Lark, D889, and In Sylvia, D891, were allegedly written on the same day, the former at a tavern where he broke his afternoon's walk, the latter on his return to his lodging in the evening. In 1827, Schubert wrote the song Cycle Winter Eyes, D911, a colossal peak in art song. Remarkable was the way it was described at the Schubertiades, the Fantasia for piano and violin in C, D934, the Impromptus for piano, and the 2 piano trios, the first in B-flat, D898, and the second in E-flat, D929. In 1828 the Merjam Sayajes Gesang, Song of Miriam, D942, on a text by Franz Schubert, the Mass in E-flat, D950, the Tantum Ergo, D962, in the same key, the String Quintet in C, D956, the second Benedictus to the Mass in C, the 3 final piano sonatas, D958, D959 and D960, and the collection of songs published posthumously as Schwanen Gesang, Swan Song, D957. This collection, while not a true song cycle, retains a unity of style amongst the individual songs, touching depths of tragedy and of the morbidly supernatural which had rarely been plumbed by any composer in the century preceding it. 6 of these are set to words by Heinrich Heine, whose Buch der Lieder appeared in the autumn. The Symphony No. 9, D944, is dated 1828, but Schubert scholars believe that this symphony was largely written in 1825 to 1826, being referred to while he was on holiday at Gastein in 1825. That work, once considered lost, is now generally seen as an early stage of his C major symphony, and was revised for prospective performance in 1828. This huge, Beethovenian work was declared unplayable by a Viennese orchestra. This was a fairly unusual practice for Schubert, for whom publication, let alone performance, was rarely contemplated for most of his larger-scale works during his lifetime. In the last weeks of his life, he began to sketch 3 movements for a new symphony in D, D936A. The works of his last 2 years reveal a composer increasingly meditating on the darker side of the human psyche and human relationships, and with a deeper sense of spiritual awareness and conception of the beyond. He reaches extraordinary depths in several chillingly dark songs of this period, especially in the larger cycles. For example, the song Der Doppelgänger reaching an extraordinary climax, conveying madness at the realization of rejection and imminent death, a stark and visionary picture and sound and words that had been prefigured a year before by Der Lehrmann, the hurdy-gurdy man, at the end of Winter Eyes, and yet the composer is able to touch repose and communion with the infinite in the almost timeless ebb and flow of the string quintet and his last 3 piano sonatas, moving between joyful, vibrant poetry and remote introspection. Even in large-scale works he was sometimes using increasingly sparse textures. Nebold compares his writing in the fragmentary 10th Symphony, D936A, probably the work of his very last 2 months with Mahler's use of folk song-like harmonics and bare soundscapes. Schubert expressed the wish, were he to survive his final illness, to further develop his knowledge of harmony and counterpoint, and had actually made appointments for lessons with the counterpoint master Simon Sector.
Final illness and death.
In the midst of this creative activity, his health deteriorated. The cause of his death was officially diagnosed as typhoid fever, though other theories have been proposed, including the tertiary stage of syphilis. By the late 1820s, Schubert's health was failing and he confided to some friends that he feared that he was near death. In the late summer of 1828, the composer saw court physician Ernst Rinner, who may have confirmed Schubert's suspicions that he was ill beyond cure and likely to die soon. Some of his symptoms matched those of mercury poisoning. Mercury was then a common treatment for syphilis, again suggesting that Schubert suffered from it. At the beginning of November, he again fell ill, experiencing headaches, fever, swollen joints, and vomiting. He was generally unable to retain solid food and his condition worsened. Schubert died in Vienna, at age 31. on November 19, 1828, at the apartment of his brother Ferdinand. The last musical work he had wished to hear was Beethoven's String Quartet No. 14 in C-sharp minor, Op. 131. His friend, violinist Karl Holz, who was present at the gathering, 5 days before Schubert's death, commented, "The King of Harmony has sent the King of Song a friendly bidding to the crossing." It was next to Beethoven, whom he had admired all his life, that Schubert was buried by his own request, in the village cemetery of Waring. In 1872, a memorial to Franz Schubert was erected in Vienna State Park. In 1888, both Schubert's and Beethoven's graves were moved to the Zentralfriedhof, where they can now be found next to those of Johann Strauss II and Johannes Brahms. The cemetery in Waring was converted into a park in 1925, called the Schubert Park, and his former gravesite was marked by a bust.
Music.
Schubert wrote almost 1,000 works in a remarkably short career. The largest number of these are songs, over 600. He wrote 7 complete symphonies, as well as the 2 movements of the Unfinished Symphony, a complete sketch, with partial orchestration, of a 9th, and arguable fragments of a 10th. There is a large body of music for solo piano, including 21 complete sonatas and many short dances, and a relatively large set of works for piano duet. There are nearly 30 chamber works, including some fragmentary works. His choral outputs include 6 masses. He completed only half of his 18 operatic projects and composed no concertos.
Style and reception.
In July 1947, the 20th-century composer Ernst Krenek discussed Schubert's style, abashedly admitting that he had at first shared the widespread opinion that Schubert was a lucky inventor of pleasing tunes. Lacking the dramatic power and searching intelligence which distinguished such real masters as J.S. Bach or Beethoven. Krenek wrote that he reached a completely different assessment after close study of Schubert's songs at the urging of friend and fellow composer Eduard Idmann. Krenek pointed to the piano sonatas as giving ample evidence that was much more than an easygoing tunesmith who did not know, and did not care, about the craft of composition. Each sonata then in print, according to Krenek, exhibited a great wealth of technical finesse, and revealed Schubert as far from satisfied with pouring his charming ideas into conventional molds. On the contrary, he was a thinking artist with a keen appetite for experimentation. That appetite for experimentation manifests itself repeatedly in Schubert's outputs in a wide variety of forms and genres, including opera, liturgical music, chamber and solo piano music, and symphonic works. Perhaps most familiarly, his adventurousness manifests itself as a notably original sense of modulation, as in the second movement of the string quintet, where he modulates from E major, through F minor, to reach the tonic key of E major. It also appears in unusual choices of instrumentation, as in the Arpeggio Sonata or the unconventional scoring of the Trout Quintet. While he was clearly influenced by the classical sonata forms of Beethoven and Mozart, his early works, among them notably the Fifth Symphony, are particularly Mozartine. His formal structures and his developments tend to give the impression more of melodic development than of harmonic drama. This combination of classical form and long-breathed romantic melody sometimes lends them a discursive style. His Ninth Symphony was described by Robert Schumann as running to heavenly lengths. His harmonic innovations include movements in which the first section ends in the key of the subdominant rather than the dominant, as in the last movement of the Trout Quintet. Schubert's practice here was a forerunner of the common romantic technique of relaxing, rather than raising, tension in the middle of a movement, with final resolution postponed to the very end. It was in the genre of the Lied, however, that Schubert made his most indelible mark. Leon Plantinga remarks, in his more than 600 Lieder he explored and expanded the potentialities of the genre as no composer before him. Prior to Schubert's influence, Lieder tended toward a strophic, syllabic treatment of text, evoking the folk song qualities engendered by the stirrings of romantic nationalism. Among Schubert's treatments of the poetry of Goethe, his settings of Gretchen am Spinnrad and Der Erlkönig are particularly striking for their dramatic content, forward-looking uses of harmony, and their use of eloquent pictorial keyboard figurations, such as the depiction of the spinning wheel and treadle in the piano in Gretchen and the furious and ceaseless gallop in Elkönig. He composed music using the poems of a myriad of poets, with Goethe, Meyerhofer and Schiller being the top three most frequent, and others like Heinrich Heine, Friedrich Rickert and Joseph Freyer von Eichendorff among many others. Also of particular note are his two song cycles on the poems of Wilhelm Müller, Die Schanmüllerin and Winter Eyes, which helped to establish the genre and its potential for musical, poetic, and almost operatic dramatic narrative. His last song cycle published in 1828 after his death, Schwanengesang, is also an innovative contribution to German Lieder literature, as it features poems by different poets, namely Ludwig Rellstab, Heine, and Johann Gabriel Seidel. The Theaterzeitung, writing about Winter Eyes at the time, commented that it was a work that none can sing or hear without being deeply moved. Antonin Dvorak wrote in 1894 that Schubert, whom he considered one of the truly great composers, was clearly influential on shorter works, especially Lieder and shorter piano works. The tendency of the Romantic school has been toward short forms, and although Weber helped to show the way, to Schubert belongs the chief credit of originating the short models of pianoforte pieces which the Romantic school has preferably cultivated. Schubert created a new epoch with the Lied. All other songwriters have followed in his footsteps. Schubert's compositional style progressed rapidly throughout his short life. A feeling of regret for the loss of potential masterpieces caused by his early death at age 31 was expressed in the epitaph on his large tombstone written by his friend the poet Franz Grillparzer, "Here music has buried a treasure, but even fairer hopes." Some have disagreed with this early view, arguing that Schubert in his lifetime did produce enough masterpieces not to be limited to the image of an unfulfilled promise. This is in particular the opinion of pianists, including Alfred Brendel, who dryly billed the Grillparzer epitaph as inappropriate. Schubert's chamber music continues to be popular. In a poll, the results of which were announced in October 2008, the ABC in Australia found that Schubert's chamber works dominated the field, with the Trout Quintet coming first, followed by two of his other works. The New York Times music critic, Anthony Tomasini, who ranked Schubert as the fourth greatest composer, wrote of him.
Posthumous history of Schubert's music.
Some of his smaller pieces were printed shortly after his death, but the manuscripts of many of the longer works, whose existence was not widely known, remained hidden in cabinets and file boxes of Schubert's family, friends, and publishers. Even some of Schubert's friends were unaware of the full scope of what he wrote, and for many years he was primarily recognized as the Prince of Song, although there was recognition of some of his larger-scale efforts. In 1838 Robert Schumann, on a visit to Vienna, found the dusty manuscript of the C Major Symphony, the Great, D 944, and took it back to Leipzig, where it was performed by Felix Mendelssohn and celebrated in the Neue-Zeitschrift. The most important step towards the recovery of the neglected works was the journey to Vienna which Sir George Grove, widely known for the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and Arthur Sullivan made in the autumn of 1867. The travellers rescued from oblivion 7 symphonies, the Rosamunde incidental music, some of the masses and operas, some of the chamber works, and a vast quantity of miscellaneous pieces and songs. This led to more widespread public interest in Schubert's work. From the 1830s through the 1870s, Franz Liszt transcribed and arranged a number of Schubert's works, particularly the songs. Liszt, who was a significant force in spreading Schubert's work after his death, said Schubert was the most poetic musician who ever lived. Schubert's symphonies were of particular interest to Antonin Dvorak, with Hector Berlioz and Anton Bruckner acknowledging the influence of the Great Symphony. In 1897, the publisher Breitkopf and Hartel released a critical edition of Schubert's works, under the general editing of Johannes Brahms, enabling a wider dissemination of his music. In the 20th century, composers such as Benjamin Britten, Richard Strauss, and George Crumb either championed or paid homage to Schubert in their work. Britten, an accomplished pianist, accompanied many of Schubert's Lieder and performed many piano solo and duet works.
Numbering of symphonies.
Confusion arose quite early over the numbering of Schubert's symphonies, in particular the Great C Major Symphony. George Grove, who rediscovered many of Schubert's symphonies, assigned the following numbering after his 1867 visit to Vienna. Number 7, E Major D 729, completely sketched but not completely scored by Schubert, with multiple historic and modern completions. Number 8, B minor unfinished D 759. Number 9, C Major Great D 944. Breitkopf and Hartel, when preparing the 1897 Complete Works publication, originally planned to publish only complete works, which would have given the great number 7, with fragments, including the unfinished and the D 729 sketch, receiving no number at all. When Johannes Brahms became general editor of that project, he assigned the following numbers. Number 7, C Major Great, Number 8, B minor unfinished, no number, E Major D 729. Some of the disagreement continued into the 20th century. George Grove in his 1908 Dictionary of Music and Musicians, assigned the Great as number 10, and the unfinished as number 9. It is unclear from his article which symphonies, fragmentary or otherwise, are numbers 7 and 8. However, the unfinished is now generally referred to as number 8 in the English-speaking world, with the Great at number 9. Number 10 is generally acknowledged to be the D 936, a fragment, for which a completion by Brian Nebould exists. The 1978 revision to the Deutsche Catalogue leaves D 729 without a number, in spite of numerous completions, and assigns number 7 to the unfinished and number 8 to the Great. As a consequence, generally available scores for the later symphonies may be published using conflicting numbers. Grove and Sullivan also suggested that there may have been a lost symphony. Immediately before Schubert's death, his friend Eduard von Bonfeld recorded the existence of an additional symphony, dated 1828, although this does not necessarily indicate the year of composition, named the Letzte, or Last Symphony. Brian Nebould believes that the Last Symphony refers to a sketch in D major, D 936A, identified by Ernst Ilmer in 1977, and which was realized by Nebould as the 10th Symphony. The fragment was bound with other symphony fragments, D 615 and D 708A.
Commemorations.
In 1897, the 100th anniversary of Schubert's birth was marked in the musical world by festivals and performances dedicated to his music. In Vienna, there were 10 days of concerts, and the Emperor Franz Joseph gave a speech recognizing Schubert as the creator of the art song, and one of Austria's favorite sons. Karlsruhe saw the first production of his opera Vier Obras. In 1928, Schubert Week was held in Europe and the United States to mark the centenary of the composer's death. Works by Schubert were performed in churches, in concert halls, and on radio stations. A competition, with top prize money of $10,000 and sponsorship by the Columbia Phonograph Company, was held for original symphonic works presented as an apotheosis of the lyrical genius of Schubert, and dedicated to his memory. The winning entry was Kurt Atterberg's Sixth Symphony. In 1977, the German electronic band Kraftwerk recorded a tribute song called Franz Schubert on their album Trans-Europe Express.
Films.
Schubert has featured as a character in a number of films including Schubert's Dream of Spring, 1931, Serenade, 1940, The Great Awakening, 1941, Franz Schubert, 1953, and Das Drei Madelhorse, 1958. A reference to Franz Schubert, nicknamed Franz the Hands, was made in the Doctor Who episode Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, in which the Fantasia in F minor for four hands was played, with the Doctor responding when asked if he knew the piece, "Say hello to hands 3 and 4.
Catalog.
Since relatively few of Schubert's works were published in his lifetime, only a small number of them have opus numbers assigned, and, even in those cases, the sequence of the numbers does not give a good indication of the order of composition. In 1951, Musicologist Otto Erich Deutsch published a thematic catalogue of Schubert's works that lists his compositions numerically by their composition date. Catalogue by Deutsch number, D1 to 500, D501 to 998, list of compositions by Franz Schubert by genre, Wikipedia articles about Schubert's compositions.
Notes.
Rita Splin, Franz Schubert, Das Dreiseindkind, Wiener Geschichtsblätter, 3/2001, 245-265, Wilberforce, 1866, pages 2. The school was much frequented, A. B. Duncan, 1905, pages 3, Gibbs, 2000, pages 25, Morris J. E. Brown, The New Grove Schubert, ISBN 0-393-30087-0, pages 2-3, Wilberforce, 1866, pages 3, A. B. Gibbs, 2000, pages 26, Duncan, 1905, pages 5-7, A. B. Duncan, 1905, pages 7, Gibbs, 2000, pages 29, A. B. Duncan, 1905, pages 9, Frost, pages 9, Duncan, 1905, pages 10, A. B. Duncan, 1905, pages 13-14, Eric Benedict, Notizen zu Schuberts Messen. Mit mir Aufführungsdatum der Messen F. Österreichische Musikzeitschrift 52, January 2, 1997, pages 64, Splin, Gibbs, 2000, pages 39, Nebold, 1999, pages 64, Elizabeth Norman Mackay, 1996. Franz Schubert, A Biography. Clarendon Press. Pages 308. ISBN 978-0-19-816523-1, Arthur Hutchings, 1967. Church Music in the 19th Century. London, Oxford University Press. Pages 166. ISBN 0837196957. The unctuous style we hear every Christmas is found in Church Music by Schubert and the Chevalier Newcomb, both known in private letters to be agnostic. Nebold, 1999, pages 40, Gibbs, 1997, pages 108, Solomon, M. 1989, Franz Schubert and the Peacocks of Benvenuto Cellini 19th Century Music 12, pages 193-206, Schubert, Music, Sexuality, Culture. 19th Century Music, 1993, 17-3-101, Splin, Rita, 1993, The Peacock's Tale, Schubert's Sexuality Reconsidered. 19th Century Music. Berkeley, California, University of California Press, ISSN 0148-2076, ZDBID 4395712, T17, 1, pages 5-33. Splin, Rita, 1996, Babette und Therese Kahns, Nachforschungen zum Freundeskreis um Franz Schubert und Leopold Kippel-Wieser, Wien, vom Pascalische ISBN ISMN 39001254161. Splin, Rita, 1997, Schubert's Nina and the True Peacocks. The Musical Times 138, s. 13-19. Splin, Rita, 1998, Die Unsinnsgesellschaft, Franz Schubert, Leopold Kippel-Wieser und die Freundeskreis. Bohle. ISBN 3-205-98820-5. Splin, Rita, 2001, Schubert's Problematic Relationship with Johann Mayhofer, New Documentary Evidence. Barbara Haggh, ed. Essays on Music and Culture in Honor of Herbert Kellman. Paris Tours, Minerve, pages 465-495. Splin, Rita, 2008, Schubert's Peppy, His Love Affair with the Chambermaid Josepha Pockelhofer and Her Surprising Fate. The Musical Times, s. 47-69, Duncan, 1905, pages 26, Mackay, pages 56, Gibbs, 2000, pages 44, Nebold, 1999, pages 66, Duncan, 1905, pages 90 to 93, A.B. Nebold, 1999, pages 69 to 72, Gibbs, 2000, pages 59, Nebold, 1999, pages 235, Gibbs, 2000, pages 67, Gibbs, 2000, pages 68, Haddo, William Henry, 1911. Franz Schubert. Encyclopædia Britannica 24. London, New York, The Encyclopædia Britannica Company. Pages 380, A.B. Austin, 1873, pages 46 to 47, Wilberforce, 1866, pages 90 to 92, Wilberforce, 1866, pages 25, Nebold, 1999, pages 173, Gibbs, 1997, pages 228, Gibbs, 2000, pages 111, Thayer, pages 299 to 300, Nebold, 1999, pages 215, Nebold, 1999, pages 210, Nebold, 1999, pages 221 to 225, Nebold, 1999, pages 218, Duncan, 1905, pages 99, Emmons, pages 38, Nebold, 1999, pages 228, Nebold, 1999, pages 254, Nebold, 1999, pages 265 to 266, Smith and Carlson, pages 78, Nebold, 1999, pages 261 to 263, Nebold, 1999, pages 270 to 274, Gibbs, 1997, pages 202, ABC Nebold, 1999, pages 385, Nebold, 1999, Ibid, and comments in the liner notes to the CD recording issued on Hyperion Records, Schönberg, pages 130, Brian Nebold, Schubert, The Music and the Man, UCLA Press, 1997, discusses Schubert's medical history and his death. Leans towards Schubert's contracting syphilis in 1822 and dying from it, while judging the evidence not quite conclusive announcing the test for syphilis. Brian Nebold, 1999, on the medical evidence, Nebold Ibid, Gibbs, 2000, pages 168 to 169, Deutsche E. Schubert, Memoirs by His Friends, pages 300. London, 1959, A.B. Duncan, 1905, pages 79 to 80, Gibbs, 2000, pages 197, Ewan, pages 384, Norman Mackay, Elizabeth. Franz Schubert. In The New Grove Dictionary of Opera. Macmillan, London and New York, 1997, Lev, Gammond, 1982, pages 117, Gammond, 1982, pages 76 to 81, Brown, pages 630, Plantinga, Leon, 1984. Romantic Music, A History of Musical Style in 19th-Century Europe. Norton. Pages 117. ISBN 0-393-95196-0, Plantinga, pages 107 to 117, Swafford, pages 211, Gammond, 1982, pages 153 to 156, Dvorak, Century Illustrated, July 1894, pages 344 to 345, Gammond, 1982, pages 143, discussing in particular his chamber music, Duncan, 1905, pages 80, The Classical Music Chamber Music 100. Australian Broadcasting Company. Retrieved August 24, 2010, nighttimes.com, A.B. Kriesel, pages 297 to 332, in which Grove recounts his visit to Vienna, Gibbs, 2000, pages 61 to 62. See for example Kriesel, pages 324, where Grove describes current, 1860s, interest in Schubert's work, and Gibbs, 1997, pages 250 to 251, describing the size and scope of the 1897 Schubert Centennial Commemorations, list, 1989, pages 144, A. B. Nabould, 1999, pages 403 to 404, Lindmer, pages 56, Grove, 1908, pages 320 to 328, 1978 Deutsche Catalog. See references below for citations containing different numbers for the unfinished symphony. Rodenberg, pages 118, Musical Times, February 1897, pages 113, Gibbs, 1997, pages 318, A. B. Schubert Ecstasy. Time December 3, 1928. Retrieved April 8, 2009, Trans-Europe Express Track